So the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, we affectionately call it Lacma, is going through a very intense reinventing, and so we're going to strap in and take a trip into the future and see where museums are going. I'm sure it will be very exciting. So give a warm welcome for Mr. Govan.
Thank you, Linda. Thanks. It's so nice to be here in San Diego. I did go to graduate school here for a year at the University of California, San Diego, and just loved it. I was a studio art major, and so I mostly hung around in my studio, went to the beach and read things, and then would go to movies at night and talk with other students. It was great. But then I left that to go to New York and go back to the museum world. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here, and Roxana Velasquez, who's the director here, is one of my closest friends and colleagues, and so we often are in conversation about museums. So I'm not necessarily going to talk about where all museums are going, but I thought it would be fun to give you an insight to what's going on just up the street, so to speak, in Los Angeles, and from what perspective. And it's from the perspective of somebody who studied a lot of art history, should have finished my MA in art history, and I didn't quite because I wanted to go to art school and become an artist. But I think that was a good thing because it gave me a sense of creative possibilities. That, you know, just to start in the Pleistocene, long ago, because at Lacma we have the La Brea tar pits. So if we want to start, we can go backwards. And you know, compared to that era, compared to thinking about 13 or 30,000 years ago, museums are a very, very new thing. They're only a couple hundred years old. But actually, it's interesting, I started to think about time and art and civilization in a different way as I was considering moving to Los Angeles near the La Brea tar pits to Lacma. Those are the Santa Monica Mountains in the background, and this is a painting from 1925 by Charles Knight that I showed in an exhibition recently about the campus, Lacma. This was in the teens when we were in an oil field. Now, you have to understand at this time, the Metropolitan Museum has a huge museum with Greek and Roman sculptures. Chicago is a big museum. Just like a farm with oil rigs. So there's a sense of youth that's really important to consider too in Los Angeles. And of course now we have fiberglass mammoths and our bubbling, beautiful La Brea tar pits. That's the pavilion for Japanese art behind. But I had a big revelation. Has anybody here seen the filmmaker, German filmmaker Werner Herzog's Cave of Forgotten Dreams? It's a beautiful movie where these caves, the Wilshire caves, were discovered. They date to about 35,000 BC. And they have art in them. And the art, he says, is proto-cinematic. It looks like Picasso, he says. And it was like a big revelation to me as I was seeing this beautiful movie that these animals that are in those caves are the same animals, roughly, not the exact same animals, as those that are displayed at the La Brea Tar Pits Museum. And so you have to think that art, human civilization, that it's not prehistory, it starts that early. And so there was a kind of, again, a strengthening of that realization, that change, that the whole idea of a museum which presents itself as stable, isn't. It's a new thing, a new way to frame an endeavor of humankind that's been going on for tens of thousands of years. And so therefore, all that effort to hold on to a traditional sense of what a museum is, seemed to me, it's there to be changed because it has to continually evolve to meet the needs of art. And there's most of the art that's even in our museum, Lacma, was not even made for museums. So the whole thing was to start for me to reverse the importance in a way. I mean, you're going to see a lot of museum building, but the art comes first. The museum can keep morphing, changing, reframing, rethinking itself. And I think that's a really important thing, is to not hold on too tightly to a very recent tradition in humankind, and rather try to think broadly about human creativity and artistic practice and artists and what's possible. Again, a demonstration of the youth of that. Now we went from the mammoths and the saber-tooths. This is Lacma in 1922. By this time, of course, all those East Coast museums and in Mexico City and around the world in Europe have built themselves, and here we are, a couple of dirt airstrips. But as you know the story of Southern California, by 1930, that exact same view looks very, very different. And that's why all the intelligentsia of architecture and design and many Europeans to move to Los Angeles, many people moved to Los Angeles for this boom, the creation of this new city. So much to be built, artists began moving. Hollywood was made because of the light in California. Early film required a lot of light and good weather, which is why Hollywood is in Los Angeles. But it wasn't until 1965 that we get a museum. This is 100 years after the Metropolitan Museum in New York, for example. Now, everybody said, oh, well, Lacma's too far behind, it'll never catch up. You know, it's always going to be the new and not best museum. But you know, time is always changing. Measures of things are always changing. In fact, for those of you who might have seen a really beautiful show that was done a few years ago, curated by Tom Campbell at the Metropolitan Museum of Tapestries, many hundred-year-old tapestries. Of course, tapestries were the most expensive, most complicated, sought-after artworks then, and now aren't. It wasn't long ago, as one of my trustees reminded me in an acquisition meeting, that it wasn't long ago that furniture used to be more expensive than painting. And things are always changing in art history, and so, you know, this idea that things are fixed is a false notion. And so when I make this talk, it's not this idea of evolution of museums, reconsidering of museums. It's a natural process, I think. And Lacma is a great place for it to take place because of its youth and it being born as a museum so recently. You probably know in the last 10 years, Lacma's changed a lot. We built 2 big Renzo Piano buildings, public plazas, and that change has caused a huge change in even just the traffic. We took our attendance in 8 years from 600,000 people a year to 1.6 million, and we doubled our exhibition space. We're in a huge growth spurt. We're done of the traditional growth. We're actually going to develop a building project now that's not about growth, but about change and improvement. So these new buildings and the campus, which continues to change. Here's an aerial view taken just last week. You see on the right this sphere, which is behind the former May Company building, 1939, is also designed by Renzo Piano. That's going to be the world's best cinema. And this will be the world's largest cinema museum, the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures. So the campus, which includes now these buildings rebuilt, public sculpture, the transformation of this old, wonderful May Company building. 1939 is Gone with the Wind, Wizard of Oz, and it was also the year Oscar was named Oscar. So fitting historical adaptation, and then this new fantastic theater. There'll be small theater, restaurant, bar, exhibition space. And then what's happening over here, just to show you the still dramatic change in our new cities, these West Coast cities. This is the new metro. LA is spending more on public transportation than any city in the world right now. So all these changes are sort of, my whole career has been watching changes, being involved in museums building, and I always say if the jackhammer's not operating, I'm not happy. Like we need to, this idea of reframing is really exciting and important, and there's so many opportunities to continue to develop our craft of museums. So I'm now showing you an aerial view of the same. This is before the Sphere, which will be the theater. This is the old May Company building above. These are the two new Renzo Piano buildings, public park. We actually annexed an entire city block. The city gave us the street so we could connect and extend Hancock Park. Here are the La Brea tar pits. This is the old museum here, and the museum is done. That 65 buildings need over $300 million of seismic and other retrofits, so the County of Los Angeles, which owns them, is not willing to do that, nor are the trustees, and so the proposal has been made to simply replace them entirely. And so that's what you've been reading about, if you've read about that in the papers. Yes, it is a big project. It's a $650 million project. And luckily, we announced a gift a couple of weeks ago that you may have read about it for 150 of that. We're a total 450 towards 650. We will not proceed until we've raised the balance of the money. That's what keeps me up nights. But and I've been involved in a lot of building projects at the Guggenheim, this is not about a building. And I want to make that really clear to everyone who says, well, shouldn't you be focusing on art, not buildings? But in fact, these buildings have to be replaced. The county is demanding it. There's no way we can continue to operate our old facilities for much longer. So then the question is, if you're rebuilding, what do you do with that opportunity? How is that opportunity a gift to rethink the experience of art? And art does need museums do need a rethink. This is what I'm here to say, and I say often, that there are a lot of biases and aspects of museums as they've evolved over the last 150 years that I think just need a refresh. This building, actually, one of its major features is that it bridges over Wilshire Boulevard. So we own this property here on the south, and the whole thing's like one giant exhibition floor held up by these towers that are at park level. I'll show you another picture. But it bridges over Wilshire. Why? To stay away from the La Brea tar pits and give more park space. We're opening up 2.5 acres of park space by doing this. And the idea is you'll be able to walk freely through the park instead of this. You know what it is to have a museum in the park. It's such a beautiful thing to have a museum in the park, so we want more park space. And it will give us this massive floor plate of 160,000 square feet, bigger than most museums, on one floor, which is exciting. There's no obvious facade, so there's no front of the museum. Why is that important? It's important because that means that there's no back to the museum, which means it's not like one culture's in the front and one culture's in the back, which for me is always the problem. I love the Metropolitan Museum, but I walk in, it's like Greece, Rome, Egypt, European art, and then everything else is in the back. And that's a worldview. It's not our worldview right now, and it's certainly not our worldview in Southern California. So I wanted a museum that represented the horizontality of Los Angeles, that represented the non-hierarchical quality of the many cultures in Los Angeles and the multicultural museum, and had a lot of other features. So here's like the concept drawing of this big exhibition floor lifted above, and the entire edge is glass. Something else. We have so many people who come to the museum, they've never been to a museum. So if there's a big brick wall or stone wall, how are they supposed to know what's inside? How are they supposed to know people are inside? This idea that you have a stone wall and then people who've never been to a museum would feel comfortable going in, they don't know what's behind that threshold. So the idea of transparency does many things. It both allows people to look in, to see that there's something going on and there are other people they might join in the museum. It also allows one to see Los Angeles and have a place to sit down and tie your shoe and make a phone call, be with your family, or whatever you're going to do, but know that the museum's in Los Angeles, this idea that you're not just nowhere. And so the museum is designed for this transparency, horizontality, non-hierarchical, no front, no back, opening up park space. The other exciting thing about that massive floor plate is it should provide enough roof for solar panels that will power potentially the whole museum. So there are a lot of other things I won't go into about it that allow this to function in a different way. Not about what it looks like, but how it functions. You'll go from the outside where you're looking at Los Angeles and everybody says, well, what about light? We have half our collection, stone sculpture. We miss side light. If you ever go to the Louvre or you go to St. Petersburg to see the Hermitage, the side light is so beautiful, particularly on sculpture. And most of our museums just have thrown it away because, oh, we don't want side light. But side light models sculpture. So there's a lot of side light, but then you walk in and you're invited into lower galleries, light-filled, and then you end up inside, the deepest inside, into these cathedral-like spaces. So you go from outside to low spaces and dark spaces to these bigger spaces. And it's supposed to have this sense that on the outside it's casual, and on the deepest inside it has the gravitas of the sacred space. Not that we're calling the spaces sacred, but there's that emotional quality to, for example, a Gothic architecture which has tall ceilings, clerestory light from an unknown source, more space above you than you imagine. That's an emotional feeling that allows you to have an intimate relationship with an artwork. So I won't make a whole talk about the building, but rather some of the principles that have gone into that kind of thinking, that this is about philosophy, not about building a big building. While we're doing that, I've always worked with artists, and so there's an artist today working at Lacma, our artist in residence, practically living in the museum, who's making these images that are not quite the size of the screen, but they're pinhole camera images of installations in the museum that are going to be torn down. So we'll have these works obviously in the new building, but the installations, the European galleries, rather than just take snapshots, we've invited an artist, Vera Luter, to come in and document them. And she makes, because her images are pinhole camera images, I don't know if you know what that is, it's a pin, I'll show you, a pin into a box onto paper, they're negatives. And they have this quality, eerie quality of dream or memory. And that is what we have of the past. So the idea is, again, we're tearing down some buildings. I know a lot of memories were made in those buildings. Kids grew up going to those buildings. So I wanted to use an artist's emotional work to capture that sense of homage and memory to that. This is her camera. There's a tiny pinhole right there, and then paper on the back here, and then these exposures inside the museum can be as much as 6 months to make one image. And this is an example of an image. There's the artist or curator of the outside of the old buildings. Somehow the ugly buildings now look pretty in these pictures. And hopefully they'll be remembered that way, of the gardens. And it's a very eerie quality, this reversal. And I love reversals because I think a lot about when I was in art school and you hit a block. What do? Flip things upside down, backwards, inside out. Really just flip things around. And these images do that. She's actually making beautiful negative, giant images of our old master paintings, which we're going to bring to the Old Master Fair in New York. It'll be kind of fun to, we're going to be featured in a booth there. So she's taking these European paintings and giving them a different perspective. This idea of a young artist having this perspective on older art. And these are very large, powerful images of some of the works in our collection, and we've allowed her to literally stay overnight in the museum and make these pictures, which take very long exposures. Even the small ones take a couple of days. But these reversals, memory, rethinking, my favorite quote in all of art history, philosophy, and writing, I think, is this one, which is T.S. Eliot, a great poet and essayist in Tradition and the Individual Talent, says, "The past should be altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past." Now, this is kind of counterintuitive. What do you mean? Isn't there a sequential order? Past, and then something else is made, and something else is made, and there's a causality. But in fact, since our understanding of the past is constructed in the present, we can never go back. We can never really be there. It is subject to change. And what T.S. Eliot was saying is it's often artwork, or what artists do, that radically reorients our view of the past. And so the past changes. Not the material actions or the atoms maybe and their molecules moving around as they did, But our understanding, our memory, as Vera Luter has that, is going to have, there's going to be a memory of old Lacma, is altered all the time. The past is always changing. History is always changing. We know how often history is rewritten. So when you think about that, it gives you this freedom to reconsider the way to look at art and museums and framing. For example, what's wrong with starting off your visit to Lacma going into a Barbara Kruger made last decade? What's wrong with starting with the contemporary and working your way backwards? Frankly, that's what we do every day. I can't walk into Europe in the 17th century today. I get up in the morning at the Omni Hotel in the present, look out the window at the clouds in San Diego, and then I have to work my way back to construct history. So the idea of reversing these things, which of course is fun, it's playful, it's surprising, is actually quite logical. So you can walk into our Korean galleries and see Do Ho Sa's, a contemporary artist, gate. He made a silk gate, a copy of his father's gate in Seoul out of silk, so light that you can actually fold it up into a briefcase. And so the entry into the traditional Korean galleries is this contemporary work. And we've done this and magnified this in many senses. The lightness, it is a memory. It makes the past because it's so translucent. Rabul Nasser Garam, a Saudi artist who has a show at Lacma that engages so many historical issues. In fact, our traditional curator of art of the Middle East and Islamic art is making a show that's all about the disruption of time. It's going to have contemporary artists and traditional art, emphasizing the contemporary and the artist's ability to reframe, rethink, reconsider that past. And of course, then those reconsiderations get embedded into our understanding of a past. Jorge Pardo, a Cuban-born artist who used to live in LA, now he lives in the Yucatan, helped me literally reframe, develop the installations for our pre-Hispanic arts. So you have a completely different frame, not a didactic one, but to remind us that these objects were never meant for museums. They were meant for the netherworld. They were meant for ceremony. There's nothing wrong with framing them in an alien situation, because a rectangular room with gray paint is also alien to these kinds of objects. This licenses freedom to develop different ways to see things, and he was having a dialogue for him with the artists who made those things to bring them forward and into the present. These reversals for me are kind of the most fun, to just turn the world upside down. But like, you've all seen this in school. That's not the world upside down. That's the map of the world upside down. The world has no up or down. There is no north or south in the cosmic realm. You can look at it any way you want. Every map is a construction. It's not a reality. And so these things we take as reality are not. And again, that's licensed to just be playful. So that upside down world is John Baldessari, who grew up not far from here and is in Los Angeles, where our Magritte in contemporary art made the entire floor blue sky and clouds and the entire ceiling LA freeways. That was the first thing. That was my first act at Lacma, was to invite him to do the scenography, and the freeways and the floor are now my office. So I live in this upside down world, which reminds me that there is no up and no down, really. These are, again, constructions of our culture and imagery and history. Or inside out. You probably know well Robert Irwin, who lives here in San Diego, just up the road. I talked with him this morning, who worked with me to develop the Garden of Palms as a work of art. I thought about Lacma, San Diego, Southern California. We ought to put most of the museum outside. Reverse, outside, inside. What's more important? And I'm not saying the outside is more important, but the gardens have served as a sort of gallery of their own, and that's been part of the idea there. This is Robert Irwin, just not long ago. He made photographs of all the trees so that you could put them in the museum, inside the boundary of the museum, so you could understand them better as sculpture and get a sense of what he was doing. A lot of people don't even know that the garden is a sculpture. The public space that we created with the gardens, with artwork, I like these blurry lines of inside, outside, so there's so many people outside, and Urban Light, which is at the front of Lacma, is an artwork, so you're already in the museum before you get your ticket, because that's really one of the most important works of art in the collection. These are Robert Irwin's trees, and they're one of the things I love about this is there are elements of the street of Los Angeles, street lamps and trees, to make this formal entrance. And there's a big joke that, you know, Chris Burden organized this as like a temple facade. It looks like a temple, you're walking through a temple because those lights are like columns. And you know, every self-respecting museum on the East Coast has a Greco-Roman temple facade. So ours is a fake, but actually theirs are neoclassical fake, and ours is real Los Angeles street lamp. So there's a nice play with that about what's real, and it's very romantic. If you're ever there and see it, he opened. I love it. He opened the lamps in the middle so you could walk 2 by 2. And you could have this kind of romantic, personal relationship to the entry and the ceremony of the museum. So we have jazz concerts there, you know, very diverse audience. The idea is it's all outside. My friends in New York said, I can't believe you put the bar and the restaurant in the front of your museum. And it's like, well, that's like an urban plaza. There's a sense of place and space. And my rule for the design of the entrance was you had to be able to walk your dog through it. Like that was the measure, so that so people could, you know, feel at home and casual in the park before committing to going to the museum. Urban life has, of course, become an image and an icon for Los Angeles. If you come into LAX, you see it. And this idea of making images, making icons, civicness, I want to end with. My board did say, because I'm a big media, movie, digital person, that's my age, and I gave lots of lectures about collecting digital art and movies, and we're in a media age, and somebody raised their hand and said, so I don't get it. We're in the media age, but you're spending tens of millions of dollars on moving rocks and putting up street lamps. What's the deal? And I did say even then, 10 years ago, well, you know, you have to take your Facebook picture from somewhere. And sense of place never goes out of style. In fact, I would argue that in the media world, the Instagram world we live in, you establish your identity by where you are. And so to have a recognizable icon is something for you to establish. It doesn't, the idea is I've watched this phenomenon, the museum selfies phenomenon. And people want to say, oh, it's not good or it's distracting. And I was like, no. We were the first museum to let people take pictures in the museum. This is about people identifying themselves with things. And yes, they might be distracted a little for a moment, but in the cumulative enterprise, it gives them a sense of identity. I know they come back. I know the fourth time they don't take the same picture. And that sense of having a sense of place and identity, I think, is really, really important. And it's worked. This is my favorite. Levitated Mass. Even the creativity involved and self-expression in seeing, I think, has a place in our society and brings people together. And of course, if somebody sees my advertisement of Lacma, they're not going to believe me. I'm the museum director. I'm selling. But they might believe their friends that they went there and had a good time. So the social media phenomena for me is a really interesting way for people to share experience and creativity. I mean, it just goes on and on. You can do a search, you know this phenomena. A lot of my art friends are like, no, it's not serious. I was like, yes, it's serious. It's people expressing themselves, connecting. Turns out all that worked, all those moving of giant rocks, is that we're the 5th most Instagrammed museum in the world. Just behind the Louvre, the Metropolitan Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, museums that have many millions of visitors, more than us. But this is, as you know, advertising you can't buy, because it's people telling people they're at the museum. The platform of the digital media space is so interesting to me that about 3 months ago, I invited a young artist who was working with Instagram. You all have Instagram, you know what Instagram is. I am not a big social media person personally, but I know about it. Anyway, I found a young artist, Guadalupe Rosales, who was using this as her medium, and so I invited her to take over our Instagram feed for 3 months. And so we really made the Instagram feed into a platform for a living artist. And she walked around LA and photographed Lacma and made commentary and sent people to other places. We gained tens of thousands of followers, but more importantly, it was using the platform as like a gallery. And it was a great experiment that I think we will continue. On the right is, here she is, she took a trip to Teotihuacan during that time. Here's the La Brea tar pits, ancient civilizations, and this was the Numu, which I'll show you in a second, Numu, which is the only museum of contemporary art in Guatemala, which was brought by truck to Lacma for our LA show. The sense of people, or just the isolation. Like, the nice thing about these sculptures is sometimes you can be almost alone in them, and they have that quality of like an Egyptian monument that, or a temple, I think. So the idea that they're pop culture, they're found objects, they're sacred space. This is a reversal because it's called Levitated Mass. This is the empty space where the base for the sculpture should be. It's empty so you can walk into it. As Michael Heiser said, the artist who made this sculpture, Levitated Mass, you know, with big sculpture, you never get to see the bottom. You never get to see it truly because of its weight. So he wanted to do something of Egyptian scale and gravitas, but with a kind of engineering and mechanical sense of the present, locked, sort of caught between the present and the ancient past. But with this sense of wonder, like that the rock floats in the sky. So again, a reversal of expectation that I think is so important to creativity. There was a movie made. See if the sound might have to go up here. There was a movie made about this Levitated Mass sculpture, which is as much about the people around Los Angeles because this object needed to move at night with a specially made truck.
I think people are just going to be in awe with this thing.
Static art is its own language. You either get with it or you don't, or can't. And if you don't or can't, then I'm not going to speak to you.
It's going to be a 340-ton boulder. Yeah, you blow it up and make smaller pieces out of it and stuff.
He said to me, this is it, this is the cluster, and this has the scale of those ancient forms.
This one's off.
This one is on.
It's hundreds of pages with literally every intersection, where they're going to cross, what they're going to do, cable companies, phone companies, power companies.
Every light we get to, we're going to have to swing out of the way and bend back or
Once it starts moving, it becomes really expensive if you have to stop the process.
It's been a pain in the neck, that's what it's been.
Not every guy, when he's a kid, comes out with a big rock, man. He's not crazy. He's just lucky.
Take a look at this, a massive slow-moving trailer carrying a 340-ton, two-story tall rock.
They're calling it the biggest mega move since the Curators. Setting, and I think that's interesting.
They parked right in front of my house. It's like nothing really happens on this street, and now something amazing is happening.
I went to the Bible this morning. There are 175 mentions of the rock.
I know everyone is not really here to see a rock, so what's really going on?
Heiser's work invites an internal investigation of who we really are and what we mean.
That last statement actually comes from our county supervisor, a politician who was moved to this philosophical understanding through this project, as well as having to cut through a lot of the red tape to move that sculpture. But by the way, that came from the playbook, if you will, of ancient cultures who were always moving things to express the power of things. Now, we don't have any slaves to move things, so it's harder on one level. We have trucks with rubber tires, but of course our streets are weak. This was an incredible effort. And I love the one woman who talks about the Bible, because the only night the truck broke down and didn't work, it was a disaster, and we didn't meet our planned route or park during the day so traffic could move by it. The sun rises and the truck was parked accidentally by a church honoring Our Lady of the Rock. So this was a really big deal that something greater had happened. Recently, a group of young artists was inspired to bring this new move, or museum of contemporary art in an egg, because it's the only museum of contemporary art there is in Guatemala, to Lacma in the same form. So this is just a few weeks ago from Guatemala City through Mexico. And this was a Kickstarter-funded project, which a lot of the museum staff contributed to, but the artists were sort of riffing on, they knew the story of the rock moving, and they had this fantastic little egg-shaped museum, and so they brought that to Lacma, which you can go see. It's hard, there's like 2 people at a time that can go in it, and they're going to do 2 shows during the LA period in this museum. But as you know, Los Angeles, LA, which you're part of here in San Diego, PST, has given a chance to also rethink art history around Latino, Latin American art. This is Carlos Alvarez's widow with the curator of the beautiful painting of Echo Park that's on view. Many works. This is an exhibition called Home, which has been so well received. There's a beautiful exhibition you should come see. We have the original poster of the famous 1916 exposition, and so the exhibition is about the relationship between California and Mexico in architecture and design, and starts here in 1916 and goes then to the Olympics in 1984. There's the poster, beautiful furniture. That's a chest by Mary Coulter, an American Western architect. It's a fantastic exhibition, part of LA. We have our own 18th century Mexico show on view in Mexico right now, which will come to Los Angeles. And as you may have seen in the New York Times, and we're all part of this, San Diego is part of it too, this Pacific Standard Time has shaken people up. Holland Cotter of the New York Times said there is a God, like that finally there's been a re-evaluation of Latino, Latin American art at a really important time. If you want, and it's hard to get in, this is one person at a time, you can come to Lacma and see Alejandro Gonzalez Iñárritu's virtual reality experience, where for 7 minutes he puts you on the border between the US and Mexico with goggles. You feel like you're there, wind blowing, bare feet on sand, with a backpack and goggles, and you feel like you're there in this amazing experience, which is designed to create a sense of empathy for the situation around our very close border, which is a really interesting project. Or this work that was just done by Mark Bradford, which is across this idea of inviting living artists to intervene with the issues of the day. But I want to say that a lot of what I'm thinking now is about being outside the museum. And so I'd just like to show you a few pictures of the transformation going on right now, and where my head is in transforming the museum outside of that building project, which I've described, outside of the programmatic playfulness, moving rocks, the inside outside, the upside down, the backwards. This inside out for me, which is being outside the museum, is driving my thinking a lot now. We live in a big, sprawling metropolis. It's practically one great city from here to Los Angeles. And there's so many neighborhoods and so many people who do not have access to our museums, don't think to come, can't park, don't have transportation, too far for school visits. What do? Can we turn that real difficult aspect of Southern California, the spread outness? Is there a way to reverse that problem? Everybody says, well, it's too far, you can't get to the museum. School bus can't even get there. So, what do? You give up? We don't have a small village with a central museum? No, I think you continue to rethink it. So we've been involved in thinking a lot, and I think that I've been involved in thinking outside the museum and being involved in projects outside the museum very much recently, and it's teaching us a lot. This isn't something that we just give to communities. This is something that we're going to get from communities that are outside us. This is the Watts Towers. You probably all know it. But this inside-outside, the connection between a thing far away and the museum itself, struck me when I was looking at this image of on the wall at Watts Towers Art Center. That's Cecil Ferguson, who in 1948 began as a janitor at the Museum of Natural History. And by the time he retired in the 70s, he was a curator at Lacma. And he helped found the Black Arts Council and the Watts Art Center. It was in the wake of the Watts Rebellion that he founded the Black Arts Council. And this is just an example of an inside-outside story, and a very moving one, because there's the story of Simon Rodia and how he built those towers without a nickel in his pocket. And then there's this other story about a man who was inside and outside and transformed himself. You may know an artist. We did a big exhibition a few years ago, Noah Purifoy, who was one of the founders of the Watts Towers Art Center, and he has he's no longer living. He both did social work and had a degree in social work and in art. And it was in the wake of the Watts Rebellion, the Watts riots of 1968, that he decided not to go into social work. He left social work to go into art and to make an art exhibition of the remnants of the Watts riots. And that the arts are essential to our society and everyday living. And he felt if there's healing, if there's pain, if there's rupture, if there's violence, the arts can be a key element of rejuvenation and repair and learning. So Noah Purifoy devoted his life in the wake of that to art, not the other way around, not away from social work practice, although he did consider it that. And that has been a strain of my thinking very strongly right now about the role of art in communities and in society. We did this big exhibition with the sculptures that come from a beautiful project he has in the desert in Joshua Tree, which you might want to see. I brought my UCLA students there a few times, a kind of dystopian, utopian sculpture garden. We brought those to the museum. But this idea of being outside, so for 8 years we've been practicing being outside the museum. We had Jorge Pardo build us a mobile film lab that went all over Riverside in Los Angeles County. We showed movies at night in the park. We gave cameras to people to tell their stories, worked with artists. We gave them the ability to make their own films. A lot of those films were made by veterans. You can see them on our website, and they're very moving stories about people who wouldn't otherwise have come to the museum or be making these things. With the Irvine Foundation, we've been working in North Hollywood and Compton, in different underserved communities with art projects. We're the largest in public school education program because we send artists to schools, but of course it's water on a hot rock. It's just a little bit when you consider the scale of the problem of schools without arts. So we started to think about permanent partnerships outside the museum. So this is the Vincent Price Art Museum at East Los Angeles College. And we have now an ongoing program with the director, who used to be a curator at Lacma, to bring our collections. We just did a show of Chinese art, all from our basements, from our storage that had never seen the light of day. It was a huge exhibition at East Los Angeles College on the border of the Chinese and the Latino communities. And so now we're going to show Egyptian art there. And so we've got a regular process of getting our works out of storage and into the hands of other museums and other communities. This must be our future, all of it. Having art sitting in a dark closet. I know there's works on paper and textiles and things that are light sensitive and that can't, but to have the rest of it in dark rooms is not cool. We should be sharing it. So this is the plan, to try to create alliances and spaces with museums that have less art and move it out there at no charge, in fact, to subsidize it. Find branches. This is Charles White Elementary School on MacArthur Park, which is on Wilshire Boulevard, but a totally different neighborhood. People from MacArthur Park do not come to Lacma very often. And so we've made an agreement with the school to make this building into a public art gallery. In fact, we worked with the kids. I've been working with the kids and artists in our collections, and now the county gave us a grant to open it to the public on the weekend, so kids can bring their parents and the public of MacArthur Park. So we now have a a branch. Charles White was a great artist who lived in Los Angeles. We're going to do an exhibition of his work. It will be partly there to honor Charles White. We've been working with artists, Mark Bradford, Ruben Ochoa, doing projects with the kids, and now that's going to be like a permanent branch of Lacma. And I thought, well, why not? Branch of Lacma. You know, you have public libraries. There's main library and branches. Maybe we should be thinking that way. And I want to say this in the right way. I love what we do. We give a huge gift to the world in what we do as a museum. But we have not, as a field, been extremely inclusive over the last decades. There's a lot of bias. There's a lot of people left out. Recently, we did a show of OSCO, the Latino group that was a real force in Los Angeles in the 70s, who never got a museum show. In fact, they were famous for graffitiing the museum in 1969 because there was not a single work of Latino art shown in the museum in its first 4 years. There are like real issues about the fact that our museums have not been inclusive and really need to change as we open up to the future. And there's nothing wrong with being self-critical because it allows us to move forward. From the moment of its inception, I note, the artist, this is Ed Boucher's LA County Museum on Fire, which was recently shown at the San Diego Museum of Contemporary Art, that this kind of self-criticism and thinking about what you can do better is okay. It doesn't all have to be boosterism, because I think we can use that energy to try to continue to evolve. This was Lacma that year. There's Ed Boucher sitting with his fan painting. There's not a single non-white artist in that picture. Today, this is the art world of Los Angeles. It's changed a lot. It's really exciting. It's much more dynamic, much more diverse. And we have to build that into our practice. This is a group of young fellows funded by the Mellon Foundation at Lacma. We have a project with the Mellon Foundation to bring diverse students who are in college into the museum world. Because I'm going to say this the right way. In the entire United States, you can count the number of colored people who are curators in major positions on one hand. That's not cool. It's not sustainable for our future. And so we have to find ways to quickly diversify just to meet the sense of our future demographic and population. And by the way, it's exciting because it's going to open more doors to take us more places. And I think to reach into communities, this is a little bit of news happening. Like the newest project for Lacma is there's a provisional vote by the Rec and Parks Department. It has to be approved by the City Council to turn an 80,000 square foot building in South Los Angeles, one of the poorest, neediest in terms of school dropout, violence, foster care, to turn this building into a branch of Lacma. We have to raise a lot of money to do it. There's a park they've already invested in because this was an industrial waste site. They built a school. And in this area, if I were to draw a circle of 1 mile walking distance from this building, there are 10,000 school kids. And there's no museum, and there's no after-school programs, there's no culture. This is a huge opportunity. It's a huge opportunity to build new audiences, to feed the museum. And so this is a little bit uncharted territory. It's risky, it's expensive, it's complicated. We've been practicing, but this is what we're thinking, is to take that spread out Los Angeles and the many different neighborhoods and see whether we can turn that into an asset. Because if I send an exhibition from Wilshire Boulevard, which is like off the chart here, to here, same exhibition, I'll get a totally different audience. Because I know statistically that these neighborhoods aren't traveling to Lacma and can't for reasons that are numerous. And so the idea, even think about public library systems. You have a main library and branches. They don't have storage, they have branches. So this is what's under discussion right now. It's complicated. It's not necessarily the future because it has to be funded and logistically figured out. But it's where we're exploring. And I know the power of art museums in communities very directly, having worked on many projects. I'll just end the talk with this one, which you may or may not have ever seen at before coming here, I transformed a 300,000 square foot empty factory in Beacon, New York, into an art museum on the Hudson River in a town that had 20% employment and basically no future. And this museum has converted that town into a place of restaurants and hotels and artist studios and jobs. And it's been a really exciting transformation of a place from an empty factory, an old building, into something that is magical and that affects many people's lives. So I know the power of museums to do that with art and to reframe. To do this project, I'll just make the last, just to bring it back home, is that the person who worked with me to make that happen was Robert Irwin, designed that beautiful facility. And if you've never been there up the Hudson, we renovated it together. It's a magical thing. You can take the train, it takes an hour. You can walk to the museum, go in the fall when the leaves are changing. And we had to redesign the parking lot, and it was the first thing because it was an ugly thing. And I always said, well, if you have to redesign a parking lot, you got to get a California artist, the best artist that understands space and greenery and light and how to transform something is Robert Irwin. And I always look to artists, as I did to Chris Burden when we talked about how to transform Lacma on Wilshire Boulevard. And he said after his speech he made when we opened Urban Light, because you know this area is called Miracle Mile, he said, I should have said we wanted to put the miracle back in Miracle Mile. But what he does say, the first text that's on a little label on the left bottom of Urban Light, if you care to read it, he says about this work that it's what a great civic place, a civil society should be, which is beautiful to behold and safe after dark. And so this balance between the real needs of communities and the beauty and power of art is our mission as museums, curators, directors, community and supporters. And I just think that Southern California is an amazing place right now to take advantage of our uniqueness, the sunshine, the outdoors, the diverse communities, the urban sprawl, the position we have on the Pacific Rim. And so the future is ours, and we see that together. So thank you very much for your time. Told to keep it under an hour, but if there, so we're, yeah, 10. Is there other questions or thoughts? Yes.
Would you wait for the...
Have you ever thought about getting what you just presented on 60 minutes?
It would take 60 minutes. And usually their stories are only 5, but no, we haven't. But
I think we should do it in the environment that we're in right now.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, I will take that seriously. I have an office that can maybe we'll have to condense it. I'm also too long-winded. I know. Yes.
I just want to know the name of that museum that you did with Robert Irwin.
It's called DIA Beacon. DIA is the name of the art organization that's the museum and organization. Beacon is the town on the Hudson River. And you can go to Grand Central Station, you can go right up the Hudson and look out the window. It's really beautiful because the train goes right along the Hudson, and then you can walk to the front door of the museum. Warning, they're not, I think they're closed 2 days, I think they're closed Monday, Tuesday, and also the museum is all daylight, natural light, so it has hours of the park, so you have to go during the daylight because Robert Irwin and I decided that that sense of light from nature was what the factory was made for. So just check the hours before you go. And Beacon is a great time. You can actually stay there in a hotel, and there's even a vegan bakery there now. That's how we've gone from 20% employment to vegan bakery because of the museum. Yes.
I'm very impressed with your progressive thought of bringing art museum to public, especially to underprivileged places. I just wonder, have you ever thought of extending the program to prisons, which is totally inside? You know, they cannot go outside.
Yes.
So maybe you can bring the arts to reform,
to prisons.
To change.
Yep. So a lot of artists have had programs in prisons that I know personally. They have had different levels of success. And as you may or may not know, Los Angeles County is spending $2 billion on a new jail because their jail doesn't meet code. It's a big project. So I reached out to the supervisors and said, you know, make me an art gallery and a classroom. I will volunteer, we will teach, we will connect. There are existing programs, so there are precedents for us to learn from. You know, there's big bureaucracy, so we have to, and there are a lot of complications with that, but we've suggested it in this new program. Currently, they don't want anybody in the old buildings because they're just already too crowded and it's complicated. So, but yes, we should all do that. Thank you. Yes, over here. Wait, hang on for the mic.
When I saw the design of the new museum, where you have one level in the glass windows, what's the consideration for earthquake?
What's the consideration for earthquake? Well, that's important because the current buildings are really not that safe. So the building is, the meeting yesterday with Skidmore, Owens & Merrill and the architects, and we've been fighting with this, but this building is likely to be base isolated, so that it's on these giant steel rollers underground, so that in the case of earthquake, it will move with negative vibration, and now they're dealing with the vertical motion. So there's a lot of engineering. It already won an award, but that design was too expensive. So we're now going to do another design, will be less expensive and hopefully just as effective. We may lose some glass, but the building plans look pretty solid, and they'll certainly protect people in art.
What's going to happen to the art while you're demolishing it?
So in 2001, you may know that the LA County Museum tried to do this with another design, and one of the big objections from the community was nobody wanted to close the museum for 5 years to replace it. So I knew that coming in, and I kind of agreed. So when one of my first things when I got to Lacma was to try to build the Resnick exhibition pavilion, and people said, "What are you doing building that? You're supposed to be focusing on those old buildings that are about to fall down." And I said, I think the thing to do is expand first so that you never have to close. So when we're closed, we'll still have 100,000 square feet of exhibition space. Before we close those buildings, the movie museum will open with another 40,000 square feet of exhibition space, theaters, restaurants. So from a public perspective, I said they're going to miss nothing because it's all going to be new and they're going to be going to that. But we will be putting our art into traveling exhibitions. We are lending them to museums. I've talked to Roxana about lending things here. So we're lending things to the Getty. So we will try to keep the art as on view as possible. We have plans to do that. You know, I don't know if everything will stay on view, but we're going to try our best. One more question, if there is, or maybe there isn't. All questions answered? Oh, one more question. Wait, sorry. Since you did raise your hand.
So speaking of parking, where's the parking?
Oh, I love this question. I spent half my life talking about parking. Okay, we're going to end with the parking discussion. Okay, we have parking. We have the good problem that we never thought we could fill our parking spaces and never did, and now, of course, we're overflowing. When we remove the parking by going to the, if you know, I never park in that lot, the Spalding lot, we're moving it to Ogden Drive. We own a piece of property near the Metro. So all those spots will be moved, not lost, number one. Number two, and everybody's skeptical about this, but I spend a lot of time with city planning, and I spend a lot of time with developers. Parking is changing. Park La Brea, which is a 7,000 person housing project across the street from Lacma, has 20% less drivers in the last 3 years. Kids don't want to drive. We all know that autonomous vehicles, whether you like them or understand them or not, are probably around the corner-ish. And if you're thinking in 20 to 50-year cycles like museums do, parking need is going to go down in Los Angeles, not up. The subway is opening in front of Lacma the day we open. That's a game changer for us because that's going to create much more capacity and accessibility. And just as my backup, when everybody says, oh, that's all too futuristic, what about the present? There are actually 5,000 parking spaces within a 5-minute walk of Lacma, which is nobody knows where they are. So we're going on a big signage campaign to market earmark them as they have in Santa Monica and many places where, you know, there's parking but nobody could find it. So we will mitigate the short-term issue. But this is a thing you should all be involved in. Southern California, which has notoriously no planning, city planning, has another bite at the apple. Because the one thing we all provided for in our cities was parking. Now, as the parking need goes down, that's all government-required parking. And the government can decide what that parking gets used for. Schools, museums, parks, low-income housing. This is going to be a big debate in the coming decades about the policies regarding the freeing up of parking as the parking need goes down, and they already know it is. And so I think it's a huge opportunity for civic engagement, and if open space and culture can play a role in the transformation of Southern California from owner-driven automobiles, which are very inefficient and dangerous. We would never permit them if they were invented today. It's a huge opportunity for all of us. So that's I could give a 2-hour talk on parking, but parking relates to culture. So thank you very much.
I think we all thank Mr. Govan for that insider look into what's happening at Lacma. And I think all our heads are probably spinning with ideas for the future and thinking ahead. So thank you so much. That was just wonderful.